Here we're going to tie a Mercury Flashback RS2. First thing I'm going to do is just put a clear glass Midge bead on the front of the hook. Next thing, we're going to prepare our tail fibers here, which I just use a clump of gray or dun colored Hackle fibers peeled away from a Hackle feather. I take a fairly generous clump of about a dozen or more fibers. We want these fibers to be about half of the length of the shank of the hook, so I just kind of roughly gauge it, measure it out. I'm going to tie these Hackle fibers right on top of the shank of the hook, all the way back to the bend, and I can take my thread forward. We can trim out the excess butt ends there. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to tie in a piece of medium pearlescent or mylar tinsel. I'm going to tie that in also right on top of the shank of the hook. We're going to take that all the way back to the tail, right to the bend. Now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of gray dubbing, and we're just going to barely coat the thread with that gray dubbing. We got to be very careful not to put too much dubbing on this pattern. This is a very slender pattern meant to not be bulky at all. So I just add a tiny bit of dubbing each time, just enough to coat the thread. Now once I get to the thorax region, I'm going to take that tinsel and I'm going to lash it down. I'm going to pull it right over the top of the hook here, and I can cut out the excess. So all I've done is just added that little strip. Now the next step I do a little differently than probably most people. I like to use a material called DNA Hollow Fusion, but you can use Antron or Zelon, whatever yarn substitute you want to use, but the DNA Hollow Fusion is white, which is what we want, but it has little strips of flash inside of it, which is exactly what I want in a Flashback RS2. And I take a fairly generous clump of that DNA Hollow Fusion, probably about 30-40 strands of it. I'm just going to tie that in right on top of my thorax. Lay down a few wraps, and I can trim out the excess. Now we're ready for our thorax dubbing. For this, I'm just going to use that same gray. Again, very careful not to add too much, just enough to coat our thread. All I'm trying to do is just cover up the thread on the thorax here. I'm not really trying to build up anything. I'm just trying to just kind of cover up my work from lashing down that DNA. Now once you've got the thorax finished, you can take all that DNA, draw it up, and I'll kind of pull it forward a little bit here. This way when I trim it, it'll stand up nice. Once I've kind of pulled it forward, I'm going to trim it. I want to trim it to about half of the length of the remainder of the body, just like so. You can kind of fan it out a little with your fingers if you want. Now once you've done that, you can whip finish right behind that bead. Trim out the thread. You have a finished Flashback Mercury RS2. Very effective mayfly nymph. Works great out here on the South Platte River on our picky tailwaters for big fish. That's all there is to it.